Welcome to another edition of Inside Politics. I'm Kevin Klein. I am joined by my colleagues at the Winnipeg Sun, columnist and professor of political science at the University of Manitoba, Royce Koop, as well as a columnist and former radio talk show host, Jeff Currier. Gentlemen, we are now days away. We're recording on Friday, April 25th from the federal election. And it's you hear all kinds of noise. It's still out there. We don't know. Some are saying we don't know who's going to win. Of course, conservatives think they're going to win, and the liberals say they're going to win. The one thing we know for sure is that the NDP is finished.
Yeah, it doesn't look very good for Jagmeet Singh's tenure as leader of the NDP, and the clearly the collapse of the NDP support across Canada. And I get Royce to his thoughts, but part of that may have to do with the extent to which that the NDP tail wagged the Liberal dog for a few years and steered the country maybe in a little bit further left than a lot of voters were comfortable with. But this says that some traditional NDP support has left the party and has moved over to vote for the Liberals. And that NDP collapse might be what gives Mark Carney the prime ministership.
Yeah, if Mark Carney forms a majority government, it'll be because of the collapse of the NDP in this election. It's going to be either the worst or the second worst outcome for the party, if you believe the polls in the modern history of the NDP. Only 1993 election was close to this, and it's important to remember that for the last 2 years, Jagmeet Singh had the opportunity to go into an election when the Liberal Party, led by Justin Trudeau, was very, very unpopular. He had lots of opportunities to pull the trigger, to defeat the government. It's very plausible that Trudeau was so unpopular that the NDP could have beaten the Liberals. They could have become the main alternative to the Conservative Party, and he didn't. Jagmeet Singh chickened out, and just a few days ago, he gave an interview where he talked about what went into that decision. He talked about he didn't want to do it because he was afraid of the Conservatives forming a government. He was putting, quote, country before party, despite that his party could have had a major breakthrough. He didn't do so because he was so afraid of a Conservative government. So if I was a New Democrat, I would be a little upset about Jagmeet Singh right now.
So I agree that the NDP collapse is certainly going to help the NDP, but I have to ask you this because we recently went through some riding changes, right, across Canada. And some of those riding changes, some would say were going to be positive for the Conservatives or for the Liberals or whatever. But it seems like in Manitoba, especially in Winnipeg, there's a couple of riding changes that may actually flip seats. There's a couple of seats in Winnipeg that are conservative that pollsters are saying will flip to liberal. Do you think that that's going to have, is that impacting this election right now? Do you think this is a part of that outcome? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know if changing the riding boundaries has as big an impact as the leader, the national stage. I think when it comes to federal politics, and Royce, I don't know, you're much more plugged into this than me, but I tend to think at the national level that people vote for the man or woman they want to be prime minister. That the local candidate has some impact on how they vote, but it's really the person at the head of the party or the party itself, I think, that probably drives more of the vote than anything else. And for example, we saw that provincially last time around here in Manitoba, that that there were people who were so disgruntled with the Conservative Party, the Progressive Conservative Party, that a lot of very solid MLAs lost their jobs, not because they were personally unpopular, but because the leader and the party itself had become unpopular. And I think that may be true at the national level as well.
Yeah, that's right. If you're an incumbent member of parliament, you tend to have an advantage, all other things being held equal. And the reason for that is the personal vote. When you're a member of parliament or an MLA, you can help out people with their problems. You build up name recognition. That can help you come election time. But what really matters is the national campaign. The whole idea is that a good national campaign will lift all boats, and a bad national campaign will sink all of them, even if you're a good constituency MP, even if you're an incumbent with some real advantages. Here in Winnipeg, right now people think there could be the Conservatives could lose seats in Winnipeg. Winnipeg West seat that's held by Marty France, the Kildonan seat that's held by the Conservatives, and that's a possibility. I think some of the projection websites we need to be careful. You know, the projection websites take provincial polls, and sometimes the number of responses to these polls can be quite low. They take provincial polls and then they kind of extrapolate those to individual seats to get these probabilities. I would be careful about that kind of stuff. I wouldn't ignore them, but I certainly wouldn't trust them 100% either.
So what I'm hearing from a lot of people right now, they'll ask me what my thoughts are on the election, and I never make a prediction. You know, I'm one of those guys that I'll pick my favorite hockey team in the last 2 minutes of the Stanley Cup final, and that way I win. But a lot of people do ask me about this, and one of the things that they'll talk about is how how people can forget what's happened over the last 9 years. What do you think the factor in that is? Because that's very true, right? Whether you're a strong liberal supporter or you're a conservative or you're NDP, you're green, whatever that may be, we know 6 months ago this country was focused on one thing: getting rid of the Liberal Party of Canada, and that drastically changed. And I'm not a believer that that was Mark Carney that made that change, but I mean I think it's important that we look at this because it's going to be part of our history, right? What changed that?
It really is a bit of a mystery, although we've talked about before that the two things that were the two biggest liabilities for the Liberal Party had become the leader, Justin Trudeau, and the carbon tax. And since both of those are gone, it's almost as if Mark Carney took the Etch-a-Sketch and turned it over and gave it a shake and wiped the slate clean. I don't know how you manage that because his economic policies, based on what we've seen so far in this election campaign, are not much of a departure from what we've seen over the last 9 years, which have put Canada dead last among G7 nations in GDP growth in the last 9 years. And there's all kinds of stats that show how Canadians are generally worse off economically under the Liberals. And Mark Carney's policies are not really very much different from Justin Trudeau's.
Well, and look at that new report that came out, and it was done by her. It was paid for and done by and put out by our government, saying that by 2040, it could be a very different Canada. Like this could be a Canada that's run by other people, not by elected officials. It could be a Canada where, hard work does not get paid off. It painted a very bleak picture in just 15 years of this country. Yet here we are, propping up those very same policies that may be leading us down this path to I don't know what path we're traveling down just seems very gloomy, and here we are still following that path.
It's very discouraging, conservatives are just like pulling their hair out right now. But I think Jeff is right. We can't discount the impact of Trump on this election. But it's also that leadership, it illustrates that leadership really matters in Canadian politics. It always has. 100 years ago, Andre Siegfried, wrote a book about Canadian politics. He said, parties don't even need platforms. All you need is the name of the leader. The name of the leader itself is the platform for the party. McDonald, Laurier, that's all you need to know. And that still continues on to the present times. I don't think we really understood how much Canadians disliked Justin Trudeau. They're just sick of the guy. Just getting rid of him made such a difference for the Liberal Party. And there is the real possibility that if the Liberals are elected, there is going to be some pretty quick sticker shock that Canadians are going to experience when they discover that actually this guy is not that different from Justin Trudeau. We saw in the UK after the most recent election, they have a new prime minister. He just popularity plummeted almost immediately after getting elected. That could happen to Carney, and if he ends up in a minority government, we could be back in the election pretty quickly.
I was going to ask you that. Is there because I said I wrote in a column for the Winnipeg Sun saying that I thought there was a possibility of a minority government where the party the Bloc Party supported the Liberal government. Do you see that as being potential now?
It's not impossible. We saw it before when Stephen Harper was prime minister. The Bloc really was the party that he had to massage, if you will. Now, what he did, Harper, being the astute politician that he was, started to introduce these omnibus bills And he would always make sure that he included one or two provisions in those omnibus bills that the bloc couldn't vote against. So he was able to maintain and massage his minority government by doing it that way. I don't know if Mark Carney and the people around him have that same level of political acuity that they would be able to manage a situation like that. But it is not impossible that we will have a minority government. It won't be the NDP this time that will hold sway, but it could very well be the bloc. That's a possibility.
So do you think, Royce, that the potential of the I'm sorry, what's that called? Minority. I'm going to cut it there. So do you think, Royce, that the potential of a minority government, could it be the Conservatives being propped up by the bloc?
Possibly. I think that if where the polls where they are now, I think the Liberals are going to end up with more seats, unless there's a real phenomenon of shy Tories, unless there has been some real problems in the Canadian polling industry. Liberals are going to end up with more seats than the Tories. The real question is it going to be a minority or is it going to be a majority government? As long as the bloc is there, as long as the NDP doesn't totally kick the bucket, there's a very real possibility that we get another minority government. Minority governments are like the norm in Canadian politics now. The one problem with this is Ontario. The Liberals have a pretty, their lead is narrowed in places like BC and Quebec. In Ontario, they're still fairly far ahead, and there is a very large number of seats in Ontario. And so it's Ontario. If they form a majority government, I think it's going to be just like in the 1990s, very Ontario heavy. It's going to be Ontario that gets them over the finish line. But minority government, yep, definitely a possibility still.
When you look at the minority government, then, how long do you think a minority government this time around will last? Because I mean, we saw this last one, because of the deal with the NDP and the Liberal government, it lasted for a long time, and I don't want to see that again. Do you think that we'll see a shorter minority government if that happens, or will we see them again play the game and keep themselves in office for 4 or 5 years?
Well, that's too tough for me to predict. We don't even know who the prime minister is going to be, much less how a minority government would function.
Yeah, it's tough to say because the parties that kind of make the decisions, the ones with blackmail potential, it's the Bloc and the NDP, they don't want to go into an election until they're ready to do so. That's one of the things that was holding Jagmeet Singh back over the last few years. They had no money. They had nominated all their candidates. So, I would suspect there'd be a quicker election. Either if Carney is a minority government, either he continues on with unpopular policies or he has to start cutting. We're heading into a period of austerity, and doing that with a minority government.
Not based on Carney's election promises, we're not.
Yeah, well, but say in 1993, Jean Chrétien ran on jobs, 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 and they turned into an austerity government right after they just turned on a dime. And
is there, Royce? Is there not a danger? Supposing the Bloc or whoever has that balance of power, or needs to be brought into the fold in order to keep a government in power. If you bring that government down too soon, is there a risk that the Canadian electorate, or in this case, the Quebec electorate, would punish that party for driving us into an election before necessary, or at least being perceived as being before necessary?
Yeah. I mean, that's
how be careful about that, right?
Yeah, parties get punished for calling elections, especially for self-interested reasons. That's certainly happened before. I just don't think Carney. I think if there's going to be a minority government, or even a majority, the popularity of a Carney government is going to drop, and drop pretty quickly. It's hard to imagine how he can actually stay popular moving forward. It's also been four Liberal governments. That's hard. Really, the Liberals should not even be winning this, but they are due to crazy external circumstances. Winning again after that is going to be very difficult.
But are they? I mean, I'll go back to what I've mentioned here before. The U.S. presidential race, everyone thought it was going to be the tightest race in American history between Kamala and Donald, and it turned out not to be close at all. So are we experiencing that same thing? Because I hear so much from people like, we don't want to be America, we don't want to be America, but we seem to be acting like them at every moment or every opportunity we get. Is that happening here now? Is that happening where a lot of people just aren't, I mean, they're not answering the polls correctly? I'll be honest, if someone polls me, I'm not going to tell them. I won't participate, or I don't want to tell somebody my vote, especially nowadays in Canada. If you put a sign on your yard, you're taking a chance. I mean, your neighbor could revolt, or anybody walking by could damage the sign, or get mad at you. It's just, it's not the simple democracy we had before. It's, well, you put a sign on your lawn, or you say who you're going to vote for, you're setting yourself up for an argument depending on who you're standing there talking to. But for the most part, I put stuff online. You get attacked consistently by people that just have very hard opinions. So, do you think maybe the polls are not telling the truth?
Yeah, possibly. There's that phenomenon of shy Tories. That's a very real thing. They don't. They're less likely to tell pollsters that they support the Tories. Two other things: the Tory vote is extremely committed. It's extremely firm, and it has been for the entire campaign. These committed Tory voters. Tory voters are likely to crawl across shards of broken glass so they can go cast their ballot for Polyev. Liberal supporters are much softer. And a lot of the reports that I'm hearing is anecdotal reports. The Tory ground game, to get out the vote, that is much stronger than the Liberal organization. So that's going to give them a boost on election day. So it could happen. I mean, what the Liberals have is they have the strength in Ontario where there's so many seats, and it's actually quite an efficiently distributed vote. They could win a lot of seats in Ontario with very small margins, and that's kind of their superpower.
Royce, do you think that from a strategic standpoint, when it comes to dealing with Donald Trump, and this seems to be it seems to be one of the big issues in this election campaign, Mark Carney has won that battle. Polyev has been he's been reticent, it seems, to get into that mix, to get into that ring and mix it up. And Carney has been at least perceived as the guy who can deal with Donald Trump. Has that been maybe the tipping point in this campaign? From a strategic standpoint, I mean.
I think I think that really set the stage for the election campaign. It's just my opinion. Is a significant number of Canadians decided very quickly that Carney was the right person to deal with Trump, and it's been very hard to change their minds. We've seen lots of evidence that Carney is perhaps not the right person to deal with Trump. There's been some softening of the Liberal vote maybe as a result of that. And I also think Polyev, he's getting a lot of flack for the campaign that he ran. I think that he pivoted pretty well on the Trump issue. He gave a speech on Canadian sovereignty even before the campaign started. I thought that was one of the best political speeches I'd ever heard in my life, to be honest. I think he's done what he can. I think it's been a difficult thing to dislodge voters' perceptions that were established even before the campaign started.
But for Team Canada, right, it was always, let's be against Trump, and they didn't want Trump to influence the election, but yet he did. Right? At the end of the day,
Yeah, Trump's gone on record as saying he wants a liberal prime minister.
right.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and
I mean,
here
that
we are.
alone should have changed things, and it didn't. It didn't. It really is a weird thing. It really people's views seem to solidify very quickly, and it didn't change. You look at the polls throughout the campaign. There hasn't really been a whole lot of change. It's quite shocking, actually.
So you're both saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, and I believe this might be true, is if we do end up with a liberal government, there could be voters' remorse very quickly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I count on that.
What do you think is the potential, I guess, going forward of Polyev sticking around if he loses. Now, I'm not going to say he's losing, and because I'm not going to predict the election. That's not my expertise, nor do I think anybody should be doing it. And all the media putting out the polls this close to the election, I think, are wrong. We shouldn't be doing that. Let people make their own decisions. But do you think, and you guys have talked about this before, well, no, I think he should stick around. But, and Jeff, I know you talk about how the conservatives traditionally eat their own and away they go. But this will say four times in a row, as you pointed out, Royce, that we'll have a liberal government. Potentially. That's potentially. What does that say about the Conservative Party itself? Not just the leader. What does that say about the Conservative Party and how they position themselves in the country?
Well, it's a great question. And, what we see in this campaign is the Conservative Party is plagued by this group of consultants, people that run campaigns, people that do polling, people that go onto national talk shows. And their interests are quite different from conservative activists, conservative voters. These are the kinds of people that want leadership races because that's where they make their money. It's not always the best. It's not always the best thing for for the party to actually win. Sometimes losing can ultimately be more lucrative than winning.
Yeah.
Jeff has pointed out correctly, the Tories definitely give their leaders fewer chances. The NDP, Jagmeet Singh is consistently disaster results. They stick with the guy. I don't know with Polyev, and again, I don't want to step on his chances before the election. But if the Liberals win and the party has a choice about leadership, I just think it would be crazy to get rid of Polyev. I mean, he's an extraordinarily effective politician. He's an exceptional public speaker. Actually, I think one of the extremely impressive orator. We're going to look back and say that he's popular in the party caucus. He knows how to run this party, how to discipline the party. And if it wasn't for Donald Trump, if it wasn't for the decision of American voters a few months ago, we would be heading towards a Polyev supermajority right now.
And if
What's coming?
sorry, Royce, if Polyev does wind up finishing second, it'll depend, I think, on the margin of victory. I mean, if he gets blown out of the water, which doesn't appear is going to happen, if he gets blown out of the water, you got to rethink it. But if this election is anywhere close in terms of popular vote, never mind seat distribution, but in terms of popular vote, and say in one scenario is the minority government, which is a possibility we've discussed. Either way, he's got anywhere from, say, 2 years to 4 years to change his image among the people who have steered away from him because they perceive him to be too right-wing or too angry a guy. That's been the perception for a lot of the people who are backing away from voting conservative this time around. That they see him as being the angry guy. So he will have time if he loses this election. And again, we're not saying this is going to happen one way or the other because none of us knows. But if he does lose, it gives him time, if the party is smart, would give him time to kind of soften his image a little bit.
Yeah.
And make him appear as not just the attack dog on Justin Trudeau and the axe the tax guy, but a guy who can put forward sound economic policies and appear as though he is the prime minister in waiting.
But is he not a victim of the media? I mean, I think this whole election campaign, or this whole election, quite frankly, has fallen victim to media. We've seen the media, especially the CBC, make Trump such a big deal and making all kinds of claims and how Trump is the 51st state. They brought up a couple of times that you see all the polling suggesting to Canadians, because everyone likes to back a winner, if both of you have said before, that the Liberals are going to win. And then we even saw recently all these media reports that Polyev was in jeopardy of losing his seat, which was ridiculous. That's not journalism. That's, again, trying to establish a narrative. So, I mean, Royce, I'll let you talk about that for a couple of minutes, because I read that in the Globe and Mail and I just shook my head. And I thought that I just don't understand why journalists thought that was a story, because there's no way he's going to lose his seat.
Well, there is no story. It was just concocted out of thin air because apparently some anonymous source released a survey results saying that the Liberals are very popular in Ottawa. Well, of course, the Liberals are popular in Ottawa. They always are. But Poilievre wins that seat consistently. He won it in 2015 when Justin Trudeau won his majority government, when the Liberals got 45% in Ontario. And Poilievre wasn't the leader. He had no national profile. He still held onto that seat. There's no way he's going to lose his seat. This story, it felt like it was there to deflate conservative supporters. It might have had that effect. But it would be nice if journalists would be critical, use a little bit of discernment. I mean, it seems like in the old days, a journalist would have said like, is this really true? Is there really a chance? They wouldn't have just kind of thrown this out there for people like me to criticize. They would have kind of considered that when writing up their story. It's not the case anymore.
There's a very
generally you're finding, sorry, Kevin, generally you're finding now in certainly in print media, which was always I think, print was always the kind of the gold standard of journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And, print, but not to diminish the impact of the electronic media or online media now. But the more I look at the different media sources, it's as if reporters are writing what they wish to be true rather than what is true.
Yeah. There you go. I think the line between an editorial or a columnist, as we call it, right, and a news reporter has certainly blurred for a lot of media in this country. As I will pick on the CBC. You watch the CBC, all of their comments and all of their paid journalists, if you will, are making editorial comments. They're not reporting on news in a lot of cases. They're making those comments. So we've blurred that line. And I don't know how that line got blurred or why we allowed that to happen. And I really think that that's been a big part of this election. And I don't know how you stop that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we're all three of us are columnists, but our columns all have to be based on fact. You can't just make it up out of whole cloth.
Yeah, you can't just come out and ask a question, right? Like, when are you going to stop stealing cars, Jeff?
Yeah, exactly.
And all of a sudden, that's our column, right? That's a story. Well, we asked Jeff Currier when he was going to stop stealing cars, and he wouldn't answer.
Yeah, no comment.
Yeah, or his answer was, "I don't steal cars." Well, we asked him specifically when he was going to stop, not if he was. So I mean, Royce, you obviously as a political science professor, you must battle this when talking to students.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think one way you can look at this is that in Canada we used to have an explicitly partisan press. There was the Liberal paper, the Tory paper, and it kind of feels like we're going back towards that. Now we actually have a lot of independent media, not the Rebel. The Rebel is kind of in its own kind of category, but there's lots of.
Give Ezra a break.
I'm not criticizing.
Ezra doesn't deserve a break.
I don't want to get between you guys on this question, but there are a bunch of websites, independent media that are explicitly right wing, that are explicitly conservative, and you just kind of take that into account when you read their coverage. The difference is when you go to the CBC. They kind of deny these sorts of biases that are oftentimes baked directly into their reporting. Maybe we should just get back to, we have a partisan press. I read the Liberal paper. You read the Tory paper. Just be honest about these things.
Well, I sat there, and I think we talked about this before when that whole thing was going on with the leaders debate and such. And if you could imagine for a second us talking about the CBC saying those people, we would be cut down in a heartbeat. But at CBC, of course, I think it was Rosemary Barton or whatever, said those people when referring to Rebel News or True North, right? Calling them far right-wing propaganda places. But
which they are.
But okay, they don't hide it. They don't hide it, though.
Well, no, but here's the problem with sites like that. A centrist or a moderate voter looks at those sites. Here's a guy like Ezra Levant going on and think, that's what conservatism has become. I want nothing to do with that. I want no part of that. If that's what conservatism has come to, I'm not going there.
Okay, but isn't the same true then for the CBC? You watch the CBC and it's not reflective of Canada.
No, it is not, but it is nowhere close to the extreme that some of the right-wing conservative sites are.
So but I think they're controlling the narrative. I think they're trying to control it.
It's left-leaning. But if as a centrist voter, I look at the CBC and I say, okay, this is left of center. It's a biased news reporting. And then I look at some of the right wing online stuff like the Rebel, and I think I can't go there. If this is who is supporting the Conservative Party, how am I supposed to support that? I can't. And I think that those sites do more harm to conservatism. If that's what conservatism in Canada has become, then how can traditional conservatives, who are generally fiscally conservative and socially liberal, like the old kind of a Joe Clark kind of Tory, that kind of mindset, how can you support a party whose base comes from that far right?
I think we have to distinguish between the Rebel and other online sources of news that have a right wing slant. I mean, there is this kind of rabble rousing aspect to the Rebel that isn't always shared by these other websites, and or either even independent media. We've seen like a real rise in independent media in this election campaign. Jasmine Lane, who is from here in Winnipeg, she did an interview with Polyev on Twitter. Jasmine is more on the right, she does have that, but it was a perfectly good, perfectly interesting interview. She did one with Lisa Raitt, a former Tory cabinet minister, that I thought was fantastic. And a lot of these people, these independent sources of news, are starting to break down.
No, but hang on. They're not independent sources of news, though, right? They're independent sources of opinion.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think
that's
that's
where we
probably
blur
fair,
things.
but
That's where we blur things, right? Because if you're news, you're news. Tell me what's happened. Don't tell me your thoughts on it. Don't tell me what you think's going to happen. Just tell me the
yeah.
news. And then if you're going to give me an opinion, great. I want to hear everybody's opinion, but you can't really say they're news.
I think some of these websites are doing journalism. They're reporting
Some.
on the news. There's some bias built in there. But yeah, no, there's definitely opinion that I enjoy. But the thing that I was talking about with Jasmine, I mean, interviewing Polyev, I don't really see that as an opinion piece. Certainly the questions that she's asking might be different than a CBC journalist would, but I think there's enormous value to some of these people doing this kind of work.
All right. I wanted to wrap this up, but I don't want to talk about it and I don't want your predictions. But how do you think this election is going to go down in history? In 10 years, when you're talking about this or teaching this to your students, Royce, what is it you're going to be telling them about this election? Without saying who's going to win. It doesn't matter what you like. People will vote and we'll stay out of that. So what are people going to be saying about this election in 10 years or 20?
I don't know. I'm going to contradict myself in like 2 weeks or a month. I think one thing I'm taking away is every campaign is kind of a story unto itself. We shouldn't take things for granted. We spent the last 2 years waiting for the Polyev supermajority, and then a month and a half ago, we realized that wasn't going to happen. And so that's what I would take away from this. But I want to see the results before I make these grand statements about the election.
For me, voter turnout. I think voter turnout is going to be really impressive this time around. And the advanced polls, if the advanced polls are any indication, we're going to see close to a record voter turnout for this. Now, never once in this country's history have we had an 80% voter turnout. We've come close on occasion. But if we're going to get close to that 80% mark, maybe this is the time. So for me, voter turnout and voter engagement is what has really struck me in this campaign.
For me, it's going to be the fact that I think this will represent where Canada really did start to follow American politics. We really did become American. We became about the American president. This election became about the American president. This election became very divisive. The parties, both left and right, became very strong left, very strong right. We saw people showing up at liberal rallies that were conservative supporters, where liberals were giving them the finger and vice versa. I think that in history, in 15, 20 years, we're going to be talking about this as becoming the point where we really truly became an American political system, because everything we're talking about, everything the media is talking about, everything voters are talking about, people online and so on, is all about the US. Here we are wanting to be our own sovereign country. Here we are wanting to solve our own problems and buy Canadian and so on, yet we're making this decision based on an American president who has less than 3 years left. He'll be a lame duck in 2 years and be out of the picture. But we're going to base the next 4 years of this country on that man that we shouldn't be even talking about when it comes to a Canadian election. We should be more concerned about our debt, how much we pay in interest, and how we're just losing our country. Hard work doesn't matter anymore in this country. Our provinces aren't getting along that much anymore. That's what I think history is going to say about this election.